There's a sentence that lives inside you. Maybe you don't say it out loud. Maybe you've learned to cover it with achievements, relationships, rituals of control. But it's there, whispering, waiting, wounding. It says, I'm not good enough. This isn't just insecurity. It's not a lack of confidence or a motivational problem. It's a psychic scar, deep and ancient. One that formed long before you had the words to describe what you felt. One that shaped the way you see yourself, the way you see the world, and the way you believe others see you. Carl Jung understood that these deep wounds are not just personal. They're symbolic. They're not just about what happened to you. They're about what you came to believe because of it. And the most dangerous beliefs are the ones we accept as identity. I am not enough is not just a thought, it's an emotional posture. It becomes the lens through which you interpret every experience. A compliment? You doubt it. A failure? You internalize it. A moment of silence? You fill it with guilt. A need for rest? You call yourself lazy. And all of it unconsciously traces back to a part of you that was never seen, never held, never affirmed. This part of you is not weak. It's young, it's frozen, it's the child who learned at some point that love had to be earned, that worth had to be proved, that being was not enough. You had to become what others needed. And in doing so, you split from yourself. You abandoned what was natural to become what was acceptable. Jung called this the formation of the persona, the social mask we wear to navigate a world that rarely accepts authenticity. But behind every well-constructed persona is a buried wound. And that wound, if left unexamined, becomes the voice that says, you'll never be enough, not for them, not for you. Where does it begin? Sometimes it starts with subtle messages. The parent who only praises you when you achieve, the teacher who shames your mistakes, the culture that worships perfection and punishes emotion. And sometimes it's not subtle at all. Abuse, neglect, abandonment, rejection, moments that shatter the child's sense of safety, of wholeness, of being wanted simply for existing. But here's the thing. The wound is not in the event alone. It's in the interpretation. Children don't have the capacity to say, my parent is wounded too, or this teacher is projecting their own pain. They say, it must be me. I must be bad. I must be wrong. I must be the problem. And that belief doesn't stay in childhood. It grows roots. You may forget the moment, but you never forget the feeling. And that feeling starts to run your life. You become the overachiever, chasing validation. Or the caretaker, always putting others first. Or the perfectionist, terrified of failure. Or the avoidant, rejecting love before it can reject you. All of these roles are strategies, not for living fully, but for avoiding the shame of feeling unworthy. Jung believed that until these unconscious patterns are made conscious, they rule our lives. Not because we're weak, but because we're human. The psyche protects itself, and when you were a child, believing you were not good enough may have felt safer than believing the truth, that you were unloved, unseen, or unwanted through no fault of your own. That's the cruel irony. The child takes the blame, because to believe that the world is unsafe or that love is unreliable is too terrifying. It's easier to believe that you're broken than to accept that you were hurt without reason. So you carry the guilt, you carry the shame, you carry the belief that if you just work hard enough, be kind enough, stay small enough, maybe one day you'll feel worthy, but that day never comes, because worthiness is not earned, it's remembered, reclaimed, re-rooted in the soil of truth. And the truth is, you were never the problem. Your pain was never a punishment. Your fear was never weakness. Your need for love was never wrong. What was wrong was the silence that followed your cry, the distance where there should have been holding, the shame where there should have been guidance. That's where the wound was born, not just in what happened, but in what was missing. And here's where Jung's wisdom becomes crucial. He didn't say, forget the past. He said, turn toward it. Not to relive it, but to understand it, to integrate it, to retrieve the parts of yourself that you left behind in the process of surviving. Because the voice that says you're not good enough is not your truth. It's your adaptation. It's the internalized echo of external pain. And the moment you recognize it, not as your identity, but as a wound, you create the first crack in its power. But this isn't an intellectual process. You can't reason your way into worthiness. You can't logic away the shame, because the wound didn't form in your mind. It formed in your nervous system, in your heart, in your body. That's why it resurfaces not just in thoughts, but in reactions, in tension, anxiety, self-doubt, isolation. You hear the words, "you're not good enough," not just in your head, but in the way you flinch from compliments, the way you over-explain yourself, the way you panic when things go well, because part of you believes you don't deserve it. This is the part that needs your attention, your presence, not your judgment. Because what the wounded child inside you needs most isn't more discipline. It's not more pressure. It's not another self-help checklist. What they need is the one thing they didn't get. Someone to say, "I see you. I hear you. You're not too much. You're not broken. You were never supposed to do this alone." This is where healing begins, not in becoming someone else, but in returning to the parts of yourself you were taught to reject. The sensitive one, the expressive one, the one who cried too easily or loved too loudly, the one who still remembers what it's like to feel afraid, unseen, unworthy. You don't need to fix that part. You need to sit with it, feel with it, listen to it without trying to change it. That's what Jung called holding the tension of the opposites, being able to sit with paradox without running away. Because you are not your wound, but you are the one who must carry it with dignity. It's strange how something so quiet, so internal can shape an entire life. The thought that you're not good enough doesn't announce itself. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It lingers in your choices. It hides inside your relationships. It infiltrates your ambition, your doubt, your silence. It becomes the architect of your reality. You start living not as yourself, but as a defense against that old voice. You overperform to compensate. You shrink to avoid being seen. You chase love that never stays. You reject praise before it can land. You dismiss your desires as unrealistic. You convince yourself that it's safer not to try than to try and confirm what you already fear, that you'll never be enough. This is not living. It's bracing. Bracing for impact, bracing for rejection, bracing for the moment someone finally sees what you believe is true, that you're flawed, unworthy, unlovable. And so your life becomes performance, adaptation, a series of emotional calculations designed to avoid pain rather than pursue joy. Carl Jung knew this all too well. He wrote that what we do not bring into consciousness appears in our lives as fate. And for those carrying the invisible wound of inadequacy, that fate often repeats itself through relationships, career patterns, and emotional reactions that feel inevitable, but aren't. When you carry unhealed childhood wounds, you don't just feel not enough in isolated moments. You organize your identity around that feeling. It becomes the baseline of your self-worth, the background noise of every experience. Even when things go well, even when you achieve what you thought would finally make you feel whole, there's a void. Because the external can't fill an internal absence. And so the striving never stops. You become addicted to proving yourself, addicted to validation, success, attention, being liked. But it's never enough, because you're not trying to build something new. You're trying to repair something ancient, and you're doing it with the wrong tools. This leads to a chronic inner split, the part of you that wants to heal and the part that still believes healing is not deserved, the part of you that longs to be seen and the part that sabotages intimacy, the part that wants freedom and the part that feels safe in shame. This is the unconscious conflict Jung described as the battle between the persona and the shadow. The persona is who you present to the world, competent, capable, likable, collected. The shadow is everything that persona had to exile in order to survive. And in the case of childhood wounds, the shadow is often full of unmet needs, unexpressed rage, hidden grief, and a desperate longing to be loved without condition. But you were never taught how to hold those parts. You were taught to manage them, to suppress them, to make yourself smaller, quieter, more agreeable. And every time you did that, the inner voice of not enough grew stronger, because every act of self-abandonment became confirmation of its message. You learned to mistrust yourself, not because you're broken, but because the world taught you your needs were inconvenient, your feelings were excessive, your sensitivity was a liability. So you hardened, or you disconnected, or you laughed through pain and called it strength. And yet, no matter how far you run from that voice, it always finds you. In the relationship where you give more than you receive. In the job that drains you because you're too afraid to ask for more. In the silence you fill with distraction. In the compliments you can't receive without flinching. This is not failure. It's a pattern. And patterns are not destiny. They are invitations. To slow down. To look beneath the surface. To ask, whose voice is this? Is this, really? Who first made me feel like I had to earn my place? Who taught me that love was conditional? The moment you ask those questions honestly, the healing begins. Not because the answers fix you, but because they reconnect you to the origin of the wound. And the wound, as Jung taught, is the place where the soul enters. This is why self-awareness alone is not enough. You can know the theory, understand the psychology, name the trauma, and still feel unworthy. Because the wound doesn't live in your mind. It lives in your body, in your emotional responses, in the places where you tense up when someone gets too close, in the places where you shut down instead of speaking up. To heal, you must feel, not analyze, not suppress, not bypass. Feel. Feel the grief of not being seen. Feel the anger of being neglected. Feel the sorrow of all the years you spent trying to be someone else. Feel the fear that if you stop performing, the love will disappear. Because only by feeling it can you finally offer yourself what you've been waiting for from others your entire life. Acceptance without condition. But this process is uncomfortable. It breaks the illusions you've built around your pain. It forces you to confront the fact that your entire personality may have been constructed as a defense mechanism. That's not easy, but it's necessary, because if you don't do this work, your life remains a performance. Your relationships remain transactional. Your dreams remain distant. And worst of all, the voice inside continues to run the show, telling you who you are, what you deserve, and how much of yourself you're allowed to express. The good news? That voice isn't your enemy. It's your history. It's the child in you still trying to make sense of a world that didn't know how to love them. And when you begin to speak to that voice with compassion, instead of criticism, it begins to soften. You realize you don't have to earn your way into worth. You don't have to prove your value through exhaustion. You don't have to tolerate relationships that mirror your childhood pain. You don't have to settle for less than what your soul knows it deserves. But to live that truth, you must first let go of the old ones. The lies you internalized to survive. The masks that no longer fit. The goals that were never yours to begin with. This is what Jung meant by individuation, not self-improvement, but self-reclamation. A return to what is real beneath the roles. A reconnection with the inner voice before it was drowned out by expectations and fear. You are not here to be perfect. You are here to be whole. And wholeness includes the parts of you that still hurt, the parts that still flinch, the parts that still wonder if they're enough. Because healing is not about eliminating that voice. It's about changing your relationship to it, meeting it with truth instead of terror, with love instead of silence. The child within you is still waiting, not for you to fix them, but for you to see them, to stop running, to finally say, you're not too much, you're not too sensitive, you're not wrong, you're not a burden, you are enough. And when you say it, not just with your words, but with your actions, your boundaries, your rest, your joy, something changes, the performance ends, the mask drops, and for the first time, you begin to live from something real. What happens when you stop chasing the answer to a question that was never yours? What happens when, instead of trying to prove you are enough, you begin to ask who taught you that you weren't? This is the moment where something changes, not outside you, but within. The striving softens, the mask loosens, the inner tension starts to dissolve, not because the pain is gone, but because you've stopped treating it as the enemy. Carl Jung taught that healing is not about perfection, it's about integration. To become whole is to bring together the parts of you that were fragmented by fear, rejection, silence, and shame. And one of the most painful fractures we carry is the split between who we are and who we thought we had to be to deserve love. The moment you start to close that gap is the moment real healing begins. Because here's the truth, you were never supposed to become someone else to be loved. But if no one mirrored your worth back to you as a child, you were forced to build your sense of self from pieces that didn't belong to you. Expectations, projections, performances. You were shaped by absence of affection, of recognition, of safe space to simply exist. And so you became someone you thought was more acceptable, more capable, more pleasing, more invulnerable, but with every adaptation, you moved further away from the soft, raw, authentic self you were born with. The self that didn't need to be fixed, just felt. To reclaim that self, you have to let go of a lifelong habit, self-abandonment. You have to stop measuring your worth by how much you do, how much you give, how well you perform, how small you make yourself to avoid conflict. You have to stop making other people's comfort more important than your own truth. Because every time you abandon yourself to be accepted, you teach your nervous system that survival matters more than integrity. And healing means reversing that pattern, moment by moment, breath by breath. This is not easy. Because the voice that says you're not enough doesn't just vanish with awareness. It lingers, it tests you, it whispers in moments of stillness, of closeness, of risk. It dares you to believe something new, but it clings to the old because the old is familiar. That's why healing isn't just a shift in belief, it's a shift in relationship. You stop letting the voice define you. You stop giving it the final word. You start responding instead of reacting. You pause, you breathe. You say, I hear you, and I choose differently. You begin to parent the part of you that was left alone. You offer the validation you waited decades to receive. You make decisions not from fear of being unworthy, but from trust in your wholeness. And slowly, your life begins to reshape itself, not around proving your value, but around living from it. This is what emotional adulthood looks like. Not detachment, not hyper-independence, but rooted self-connection. You're no longer looking for someone to save you. You're no longer waiting for perfect circumstances to make you feel whole. You've remembered something deeper than belief. You've remembered your essence. And from that place, everything changes. You start to say no to what drains you, not out of defensiveness, but out of self-respect. You stop apologizing for your needs. You stop over-explaining your feelings. You stop shrinking in the presence of others' projections. Because now, your worth is not on trial. It's embodied. You're no longer asking the world to validate what you've finally come to accept. You're no longer performing for love that used to cost you your authenticity. You're no longer afraid to be seen without the armor. This is not arrogance. It's alignment. It's what happens when you reunite with the parts of yourself you once disowned. The sensitivity that was called too much becomes your intuition. The emotion that was dismissed as weakness becomes your depth. The quietness that was misunderstood becomes your strength. You stop trying to prove your humanity and start living it. And in this space, something else becomes clear. All those years you thought you were broken, you were actually breaking open. The wound didn't make you less, it made you real. It brought you here, to this point of clarity, of honesty, of self-recognition. Jung often spoke of the self as the organizing principle of the psyche, the totality of who we are, both conscious and unconscious. The self is not the ego, it's not the mask, it's not the story, it's the deeper intelligence that holds the truth of your being. And when you begin to live from that place, you stop resisting what you feel. You stop fighting your history. You stop demanding that others complete what was broken in childhood. Instead, you start relating to yourself as a whole person, not a project to fix, but a soul to embody. You understand that healing is not a straight line, that some days the old voice returns, that some nights the shame resurfaces. But now you meet it differently. You meet it with awareness, with grace, with the knowing that just because the thought is there doesn't mean it's true. You no longer collapse under the weight of, "I'm not enough." You observe it, you trace it, you sit with it, and then you let it go. Not because it never mattered, but because it doesn't define you anymore. You've outgrown it, not by force, but by return. Not by perfection, but by presence. This is what Jung called individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming who you are, not who the world told you to be. It's not a destination, it's a process, a remembering, a peeling away of the false to uncover the essential. And at the heart of it, there's no secret formula. Just this: you are already enough. You've always been enough. The only thing that ever stood in the way was the voice that told you otherwise. Now, it's your turn to speak. Not to argue with the voice, but to rise above it. To choose self-loyalty over self-betrayal. To live like someone who knows their worth. Not because someone gave it to you, but because you came back and claimed it. And that is what makes all the difference.